a pleasure to be here to talk to Professor Wang Wen and to discuss the bilateral relationship between Brazil and China and also the situation on international affairs. Brazil is facing now very difficult moments because of the ongoing relationship with the United States, and I think we have a lot to discuss here. And I have the first question for us is exactly about that, which is recently the U.S. has imposed 50% tariffs increase on Brazil. In April, China has also faced a threat up to 140% tariffs, but ultimately succeeded in making Trump back down. What experience has China gained from countering the U.S. tariff hikes? This is very important for us. So, Professor Wang Wen, if you could elaborate a little bit on that, it would be great.
Yeah, thank you, my friend Feliciano. So it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to dialogue with you. And firstly, I very thank you for your confirmation of Chinese resistance to the U.S. Tariff war. So actually, my friend, I have to share with you a secret, a very important secret. That is, China has been preparing for this tariff war at least 7 years since the tariff, since Trump 1.0 era. Because at that time, since Trump launched the first tariff war against China in 2018. I don't know whether you remember, kidnapped Meng Wanzhou in Canada and imposed an embargo on Huawei. And since that, China has given up its illusion about the United States. In China's views, the essence of American imperialism has been fully imposed, and the United States cannot give up its strategy to contain China, let alone be a selfless, fair, and just country. It's impossible to achieve national security by relying on the United States. And China must rely on ourselves. Since then, China has accelerated the process of de-Americanization in terms of technological independence, trade independence, and resource independence. Let me share the three independence viewpoints with you one by one. In terms of technological independence, China's investment in scientific and technological research and development has increased by about 15% annually, achieving catch-up in fourth intelligence revolution. Not only software products such as DeepSeek and TikTok that you may be using, but also hardware products such as drones, robots, chips. So China has gradually achieved a local substitution of technological products. So this has promoted China to maintain a strong counterattack capability against the United States in trade of the technological products. That's first. Secondly is that in terms of resource independence, China has adopted a very precise rare earth control strategy. As you may know, China rare earth exports account for about 90% of the global market. And without rare earth imports, the United States cannot produce many high-end weapons and high-tech products. And the United States has to seek negotiation and compromise with China. The third is that in terms of the trade autonomy, trade independence, China has promoted a diversified international strategy in the first half of the 2025. I mean, this year, China total trade with the United States fell by about 20%. But, China total foreign trade increased by 2.9%. China total trade with the energy market has increased by 10 to 15%, such as Africa, Central Asia, Latin America, including Brazil. And in 2014, trade with the United States accounted for about 20% of the China total foreign trade. But now it has dropped to about 10%. So in other words, the United States is still very important, but the United States is not that important, right? So it is worth mentioning that the China manufacturing industry accounts for more than 30% of the world, and it's replaceable in the global supply chain, and China products are highly competitive in the world. So in other words, I think that in current bilateral trade relationship, as you mentioned, between China and the US, compared with 7 years ago, the United States needs China more, not China needs the United States more. So from this point of view, on the surface, China is fighting against the tariff war launched by the United States. But in essence, China is fighting against the hegemony of the United States and getting rid of its dependence on the United States. And China are willing to cooperate with the United States, but cooperation with the United States cannot be achieved by kneeling down, but by fighting. So China is increasingly aware that the United States is unreliable and can only rely on our own national independence and national autonomy. So that's why I want to share with you is that my Brazil friends, Brazil is also making the same efforts as China. I have been to Brazil 5 times and I have many Brazil friends in São Paulo, Brazilian, Rio, Belo Horizonte. And Brazil is also on the road of the national independence and national autonomy and dare to fight against the United States. They are all very admirable. So China supports Brazil's national independence and economic autonomy, and it's more willing to carry out win-win and equal cooperation with Brazil. So I believe that Brazil has a wisdom and means to fight against the U.S. tariffs. So that's my suggestion and sharing viewpoints, my friend.
No, thank you, Professor Wang Wen. Very good points you raised. I think we have a lot of similarities between Brazil and China vis-a-vis the United States. Just a couple of numbers. So, for example, in 1990s, the U.S. was 30%, 35% of Brazil exports. Today, 2025, the U.S. is 12% of Brazil exports, whereas China in the 1990s was like 1% of Brazil exports, and now China has 30%, 35%, depending how you count of the Brazil exports. So there is a clear change in Brazil's relationship to the United States compared to Brazil's relationship with China. So I do think that Brazil and China bilateral relationship today is at its best in many years. I think President Lula worked very hard since the beginning of his administration to reorganize and to reframe the bilateral relationship between Brazil and China. I think the President Lula and President Xi Jinping have a good relationship. And every time they meet, there are new partnerships coming out, new Chinese investments in Brazil coming out, new Brazil market access to China for Brazil coming out of these meetings as well. However, and I always say that the United States is still very powerful vis-a-vis Brazil. You have to realize the geography matters. We are in this side of the world. We are closer to the United States. There are approximately 1.5 million Brazilians who live in the United States. Although China is Brazil's number 1 trade partner, the United States is still Brazil's number 1 investor. So Brazil invests, the United States invests a lot in China. If you look at the investment stock, which is the amount of investment that Brazil has received over the decades, US and European Union is still very high compared to China. China is increasing. You can see the diversification of Chinese investment in Brazil. In the first wave of investments, the Chinese were mostly concentrated in the electrical grid and infrastructure. But now, because of Xi Jinping and President Lula's relationship, you can see a number of Chinese companies coming to Brazil. For example, the other day there was an interesting article in a Brazil newspaper talking about one avenue here in São Paulo. They are already called the Little China Avenue because it's a business sector. So many new China offices are being opening now from Chinese companies. They have now 2 or 3 new Chinese restaurants owned by Chinese expats that live in Brazil. It's a very affluent, ultra-rich neighborhood that the Chinese companies are coming in. There are approximately 55 new Chinese companies in the area alone. That's just one city in Brazil. So there you can see the diversification of the Chinese investment, right? When President Xi Jinping had a state visit in Rio November last year, a number of new investments were announced. The most symbolic one is BYD new factory plant in the state of Bahia. They bought the facility that Ford from the United States had left. Ford had left. They left the entire facility there, and a Chinese BYD bought it. So it's like a symbolic replacement of a U.S. company that had been in Brazil for over 80 years that is now being taken over by Chinese companies like BYD. Some experts believe that BYD will hold 10% of Brazilian car market in the next couple of years. I'm waiting myself to buy a BYD car for the first. I will have a Chinese car for the first time in my life. So you can see that this relationship is changing. But that doesn't mean that the United States and President Trump doesn't have a lot of influence in Brazil. And the influence in Brazil has to do with the fact that a big political group here in Brazil favors very much bilateral relationship between Brazil and the United States. The Bolsonaro group. During the Bolsonaro years, when the Bolsonaro presidency, the bilateral relationship between China and Brazil got really complicated. But then at some point, it became obvious for the Brazilian side that no matter the presidency of Brazil, no matter who is in charge in Brazil, whether it's coming from the left or it's coming from the right, the economic relationship with China is much more important because Bolsonaro worked hard to stop the relationship between Brazil and China. But the farmers that export commodities to China who voted for Bolsonaro, they were against Bolsonaro in the Congress, and they pushed so hard for the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil to step down because he was actually working very hard against China, the Chinese embassy in Brazil and Chinese interest in Brazil. So China didn't have to do anything. The Chinese embassy here in Brazil didn't have to do anything. All he needed was to wait for the Brazilian farmers who voted for Bolsonaro, but export and make a lot of money to China to tell Bolsonaro, look, you cannot be so aggressive to China. You have to be more diplomatic. No, if you don't like the Chinese for some political reason, you have to control yourself. So Bolsonaro had no other option but to fire the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil and replace to another one who was more friendly. So that was an indication that the economic relationship and the political relationship between Brazil and China is today for Brazil as important as the economic and political relationship between Brazil and the United States. So there are only two countries in the world that can have this domestic influence in Brazil. The United States, traditionally, and now a new actor, China. So these are the two, of course, they're the biggest economies in the world. We have a strong trade with them. So they have this leverage in the Brazilian society. But however, now we have this problem with Trump. I've been giving interviews to the Brazilian media every day since the second wave of tariffs. He imposed on Brazil 50% of tariffs. That's above of all other, with the exception of China, is higher than all the other countries. Most of the countries receive now in this wave 20 to 30% tariffs. We receive 50% tariff. This 20% difference is related to two issues. Number one, the American big tech companies don't want to be taxed and do not want to be strongly regulated here in Brazil because there is an ongoing debate in Brazilian Congress and also at the Supreme Court on how to regulate big techs in Brazil, Meta, Facebook, Google, and all these companies. That's number one. And number two, that President Trump wants to change the Brazilian government. He wants President Lula to step down, to lose the next election in 2026, and the new president to be a right-wing president that is more closer to the United States and more anti-China. So he's working hard into that direction. So what the United States is trying to do in Brazil, it's a regime change now. They want to do that. And they are starting to do that with tariffs. Tariff is just the beginning of a longer crisis that we're going to have for the next year until the election of October 2026 in Brazil, with the ongoing and increasing American attacks and sanctions and interference in Brazilian domestic affairs. So the experience that you told us on the China-U.S. negotiations on tariffs is important for us because we have to come up with a strategy in Brazil. We are on this strategy is being under discussion very heavily now in the Brazilian government. But we have to come up with a strategy in which we can contain the United States. We cannot fight back the United States, but we have to contain the negative effects of the ongoing crisis and the additional instruments that the United States can use against Brazil in until 2026. I'll give you just to finalize one final example. The United States has the ability and the capacity today to impose sanctions against Brazil on the military area. A lot of Brazilian weapon systems are imported either from Europe or the United States. So if the United States, if the crisis get worse and the United States decided to actually be more aggressive, even more aggressive to Brazil, they can sanction these weapon systems that we bought from the United States, and then we will not be able to buy new parts, for example, for helicopters of the Air Force, for parts for the fighters of the Air Force, or even parts for Brazilian submarines. So we are very fragile on this situation. So we have to be very careful in the way we negotiate with the United States. It will be great if we could, for example, now start to buy Chinese weapon systems. We don't have a single Chinese weapon system in our armed forces. The military in Brazil, they don't trust much Chinese weapon systems. But I think the last conflict between India and Pakistan has shown that Chinese weapon systems, aircraft, the fighters, the airplane fighters that the Pakistani used against India were all Chinese, and they won. It showed to the world that Chinese technology in the area of military technology, it's as a cutting edge. It's as good as many other Western weapon systems from the West. So we have to diversify, because the key word here for us is to diversify. Just like you said, in China, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the U.S.-China trade was 20% for China. Now it's 10%. So in China was able to, even started losing this part of the United States, and increase its general trade by 2.9%. Brazil has to learn how to do the same.
Point, a very important point. That is, nowadays we have to rethink about USP Germany. Not only rethink, but also unthink. To our question is that, because you are invited to a roundtable on the human rights between China and Latin America. So you mentioned right now, I totally agree. That is all the countries, especially emerging economy like China and Brazil. So we have to keep our necessary ability to protect our independence, not only the economy but also the human rights. So I have to share with you is that, and then I have to listen to your viewpoint is about the human rights. Why I want to organize such a big roundtable between China and Latin America on human rights, because I think nowadays we face the same conditions to rethink about U.S. human rights value. I don't know whether you know, in the past, Chinese all worship Western human rights value, special protection value, and thought that the United States was our destination. I don't know how Brazil think about it, but 20 years ago, so we often think about, USA is our destination. We should grow up like the United States, especially our human rights. So, but now we no longer worship and yell for the West, and we are even reflecting on the path of Western human rights protection. So I want to share with you is that, in my opinion, Western human rights protection is a human rights protection based on the capital as a free foundation. And if you are rich in the United States, you will enjoy very good human rights protection, clear water, high-end community, and legal service, medical facility, social security. Have no money and are poor, then your human rights will be very bad. In the COVID-19 crisis from 2022 to 2023, the United States has more than 2 million deaths due to the infection, and most of them are poor. So in essence, the COVID-19 crisis is a crisis of poor, in contrast. And China human rights protection more equal and more preferred to the vast number of middle and low income people. That's what I want to share with you is about there's a social human rights protection value or path. In China, the price of a basic public service is very, I know in Brazil it's same. And for example, the subway ticket is about $50, which is 15% of that in the United States. And there are free lawyer assistance service in the US. And the cost of the lawsuit for the poor are very low. And China general medical expense are very efficient and cheap. And if you have a fever or bad cold, you can go to the hospital at any time to get a quick and cheap treatment instead of having a private doctor. So I have worked in the United States many years ago, and I can guarantee that in China, people with a monthly salary of $1,000 enjoyed more social services than those with a monthly salary of maybe $5,000 or $6,000 or even $10,000 monthly in the United States. In China, the rich and the official are uncomfortable as the taxes on the rich are very high, and they dare not to be high profits. If they show off their wealth publicly, they will be condemned by the society. So officials are strictly managed. So I dare say that the anti-corruption and the discipline inspection of the Chinese officials are the strictest in the world. So I know that those issues are controversial in the Western public opinion. And also I have to share with you is that there are also the issues of the Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, etc. that are often accused in the Western media. So I dare say that most of them are lies and fake news and are not worth refuting. So the West has no right to accuse and discredit China human rights development. I think sometimes they will, as you mentioned, they often criticize Brazil, contain Brazil, and demonize Brazil. So nowadays we have to say is that when we talk about human rights, because we will meet in the end of the July on the long table on human rights between China and Latin America. So when we talk about human rights, so what we should pay more attention to is to respect the human rights development path of each country. And perhaps the United States has its own path to human rights development. And if the American people are willing, we have no right to criticize it. But China also has its own path to human rights development, and the United States has no right to criticize or intervene. So mutual respect and mutual learning about the civilization are the best ways to treat the human rights development path of various countries. So that's why I want to share with you. I want to ask with you, Feliciano. So how do you think about the Latin American human rights, and how do you think about the coming possible cooperation on human rights fields between China and Latin America?
Thank you for the question. I think human rights for us here in Brazil, it's a very important issue because we suffered very much from a military dictatorship in Brazil for 21 years. And when we returned to democracy in 1980, depends how you count, 1985, 1990, two Brazilian governments, one after the other, has enforced human rights in Brazil. Brazil signed the vast majority, almost the totality of human rights international treaties, and to protect ourselves, because we have a history in our own country that some Brazilians, supported by the United States in 1964, imposed a military coup in Brazil. It was 21 years of dictatorship. A lot of Brazilians were persecuted and were sent to jail, were murdered, or sent abroad. So human rights for us, from a political point of view, but also from a social point of view, is key in Brazil. However, it's a developing country. So when it comes to social rights, the rights that you were mostly speaking of, we are lacking behind. Brazil has improved a lot in terms of social access to healthcare, to sanitation, to vaccines. And vaccines were very helpful. The help that we received from China during the COVID crisis, but we still have a lot to go. I do think, for example, I don't know China very well, but I think if you are a poor Chinese, is probably much better off than a poor Brazilian, because he'll have more access to a number of social agencies of the state of China that can provide them with healthcare, with sanitation, all that, in a way that we still don't have in Brazil. But our law, it's the Constitution of Brazil protects every single Brazilian, at least from a legal point of view, when it comes to its human rights. So, for example, we have free healthcare in Brazil. I have a couple of American friends who were in Brazil and suffered an accident. They had to be sent to a Brazilian public hospital. They received the entire care for free. They did not pay a single dime, a single real for the entire healthcare. So, and I talked to them. So, how did it go? I mean, you went to a Brazilian hospital and you had injury and they fixed you. and you didn't pay. He said, and I remember one of them saying to me, this was the most democratic experience I had in my life, because I entered a hospital, suffering. They fixed my problem. I walked out of the hospital without any debt. I didn't owe any money to anyone. This is enshrined in our constitution. The hospital is not the best hospital. The hospital is not these amazing hospitals that you see in America or amazing hospital that you see here in Brazil to the Brazilian rich. These are basic public hospitals. But they fix you. They provide you with the basic health care. So what the discussion in Brazil here when it comes to social rights of human rights to the people, as I said, the basic means from education point of view, from sanitation. We have a serious problem with sanitation in Brazil. For example, if you go to Manaus, a city in the heart of the Amazon forest, it's a big city, it's a 2.5 million people. Only 10% of the population have access to sanitation. 90% of the population have no sewage system. So the amount of diseases that you can get there is much, much higher because you have no sanitation in the city. So you see, we are really lacking behind. We still have a lot to learn with the Chinese experience and how to solve these basic social problems that are still lingering in Brazil.
Brazil, I really learned a lot from you about Brazil conditions.